Welcome to Cat Has Questions, curiosity, stories, and the strange corners of everyday life. A young mother disappears while out for a jog in broad daylight. Her phone is found abandoned on the side of the road, her hair tangled in the earbuds left behind. And 22 days later, no one knows where she is. Then, on Thanksgiving morning, she reappears, chained on the side of a California highway, bruised, injured, and claiming she was kidnapped by two armed women. For years, the country viewed Sherri Papini as a survivor, until investigators uncovered evidence that suggested something far more complicated and started asking one very uncomfortable question. What if none of it ever happened? Hello, I'm Kat, and this is Kat Has Questions. And today, we're talking about one of the most bizarre and polarizing disappearances in recent memory. Because this wasn't just a missing persons investigation. It became a story about fear, media narratives, public sympathy, and what happens when the story people emotionally believe starts falling apart behind the scenes. Here's what we know. In November of 2016, the story of Sherri Papini seemed to tap directly into one of the most visceral fears people have. The idea that someone could simply disappear in the middle of an ordinary day. Because nothing about Sherri Papini initially looked suspicious. She was a 34-year-old mother of two, living in Redding, California. From the outside, her life appeared intensely normal. Married, young kids, quiet suburban routine. The kind of person people described as involved, friendly, devoted to her family. And almost immediately, the public image that formed around her was incredibly specific. The attractive young mother who vanished without warning. Sherri Louise Grafe was born on June 11, 1982, and grew up in Mount Shasta, California. Sherri Papini had spent most of her life in the Redding, California area. People who knew her often described her as charismatic, energetic, and very image-conscious. By the time she disappeared in 2016, she and her husband Keith appeared to embody a very specific version of a suburban family life. Young children, a quiet neighborhood, routines that felt familiar and safe. And honestly, that image became an important part of why the case exploded nationally. Because from the outside, the Papinis looked relatable. They looked like the kind of family people could easily project themselves onto. Sherri and Keith had reportedly met years earlier and eventually reconnected as adults before getting married. By the time of her disappearance, Keith was working for Best Buy. Sherri was primarily home with the children, and people close to the family publicly described them as loving and close-knit. At least publicly, there didn't appear to be any obvious reason for Sherri to suddenly disappear, which is part of what makes this case feel so alarming at the time. She married Keith Papini in October 2009. The couple had two children together, one son and one daughter. On November 2nd, Sherri reportedly went out for a jog near her home and never came back. When her husband Keith Papini returned home from work, he found something unsettling. Sherri was gone, the kids had not been picked up from daycare, and eventually, using the Find My iPhone app, he located her phone abandoned near a rural road. Alongside it were strands of blonde hair and a pair of earbuds. And honestly, from the beginning, the scene felt cinematic in a way that immediately captured national attention. A missing mother, a deserted jogging route, personal belongings left behind, no obvious explanation. People didn't just see it as a missing persons case. They saw it as every family's nightmare. Almost immediately, the community mobilized. Search parties formed, flyers spread everywhere, local news stations picked up the story, then national outlets followed. The FBI became involved. Social media exploded with theories, warnings, and fear. And underneath all of it was a very specific cultural anxiety that was especially prominent at the time. The fear of random abductions and human trafficking. Because according to the narrative forming online, Sherri Papini hadn't just disappeared. She had potentially been taken. That possibility changed the emotional temperature of the entire case. Parents were suddenly paying closer attention to their surroundings. Women were sharing self-defense tips online. People discussed whether it was safe to jog alone. The case became bigger than one missing woman because people projected themselves into it so easily. And then there was Keith Papini. In interviews, Keith appeared to be devastated. He cried on camera. He spoke emotionally about wanting his wife home. At one point, he described smelling Sherri's clothing after she disappeared because it was all he had left of her. At the time, people saw Keith as just this devastated husband, desperately trying to bring his wife home. Years later, those same interviews take on a very different feeling. And those interviews mattered, because emotionally, they helped cement the story in people's minds. This didn't look like a complicated investigation. It looked like a tragedy unfolding in real time. And in cases like this, once the public emotionally commits to a narrative, it becomes very difficult to question it later. At this point in the story, most people weren't wondering whether Sherri Papini was lying. They were wondering who had taken her. Then, on Thanksgiving morning, 22 days after she vanished, everything changed. At around 4:30 in the morning, a driver traveling along Interstate 5 near Woodland, California, called 911 after spotting a woman on the side of the road. It was Sherri Papini. And the details that emerged sounded horrifying. According to investigators, Sherri was found partially restrained with a chain around her waist. She appeared extremely thin. She had lost a lot of weight. She had bruises, burns, and injuries across her body. Her hair had been cut short. And perhaps most disturbingly, there was what authorities described as a branding mark on her shoulder. Suddenly, the case transformed from a missing person story into what appeared to be a kidnapping survival story. And this is the moment that really locked people in. Because if there had been lingering doubts before, if anyone had quietly wondered whether Sherri had left voluntarily or disappeared intentionally, those doubts largely evaporated after she returned. The physical evidence seemed too severe, too extreme, and way too specific. Who would do this to themselves? According to Sherri, she had been abducted by 2 Hispanic women at gunpoint while out jogging and held captive for weeks. She claimed the 2 Hispanic women took steps to keep their faces hidden from her, either by wearing masks or by keeping Papini's head covered. She was branded on her right shoulder during captivity with the word Exodus. When investigators questioned Sherri at a later date, she claimed that it looked like a verse from the book of Exodus from the Bible. According to a statement by her husband, Keith Papini, Sherri was physically abused during her captivity. She had her nose broken and her hair cut off and weighed 87 pounds when she was released. At that time, the sheriff said that it was still an active investigation, and authorities were looking for a dark-colored SUV with 2 Hispanic females armed with a handgun. Detectives had authored close to 20 search warrants, including some in Michigan, and said they were examining cell phone records, bank accounts, email, and social media profiles. The FBI provided assistance during this case. Papini was found with both male and female DNA on her, neither of which matched her or her husband. The FBI ran the samples through CODIS and found no matches. CODIS is the Combined DNA Index System. It's a very largely used database for law enforcement and different things like that when they're trying to find criminals. The details of her account shifted somewhat over time, but the broad narrative remained the same. She had escaped a terrifying ordeal. And honestly, looking at the case from the perspective of the public in late 2016, the story felt believable. Not just believable, emotionally convincing. The images released after her return showed visible injuries, and investigators publicly treated the case seriously. News outlets framed her as a survivor. Sympathy poured in nationally. People wanted the story to make sense. A young mother disappears, a violent abduction occurs, she survives, she comes home. That's a narrative people understand. It fits cleanly into the structure of fear and relief. And importantly, at this stage, investigators themselves had not publicly dismantled her story. So for the public, this wasn't a hoax. It was a miracle survival story. But investigators were already beginning to run into a problem. The evidence wasn't fully cooperating with the narrative that everyone was accepting. As the weeks turned into months, investigators started encountering a problem that would slowly reshape the entire case. The story was dramatic, and the evidence was less than straightforward. Most people still viewed Sherri as a victim, and the news coverage supported that. Sympathy remained overwhelming. But quietly, investigators were beginning to notice inconsistencies. For one thing, there was surprisingly little evidence supporting the existence of these alleged kidnappers. So Sherri had said the 2 Hispanic women abducted her and held her for 3 weeks. Investigators released sketches based on what she said they looked like. Leads were pursued, but over time, the descriptions themselves became difficult to reconcile clearly. Certain details began shifting, and other details were frustratingly vague. And despite the scale of the investigation, there was no meaningful trail leading to the two kidnappers. No confirmed witnesses, no surveillance, and no real clear motive. No evidence of trafficking, nothing concrete tying actual suspects to the crime. And then there was the DNA. Because investigators found male DNA on Sherri's clothing after her return. At first glance, that might sound like confirmation that an abduction had occurred, but the immediate issue was that the DNA did not belong to Keith Papini. And more importantly, it didn't align with her story that the investigators were being told, because she said it was two females, so where did this male DNA come from? For years, the DNA sat almost like a question mark hanging over the entire case. Because if the two women had kidnapped Sherri, why was unidentified male DNA involved? And slowly, investigators started looking backward instead of forward. They revisited timelines, re-examined behaviors, and re-interviewed people from Sherri's past. And that's when additional concerns reportedly began surfacing. Investigators learned about prior instances where Sherri had allegedly fabricated stories or manipulated situations for attention. There were reports involving self-harm accusations against family members from years earlier, and questions emerged about an old relationship and communication patterns. People who knew her in her earlier life have described her very differently depending on the source. Some remembered her as charismatic and outgoing. Others described her as dramatic or attention-seeking. Several former classmates later spoke to the media outlets after this hoax kind of was revealed. Another thing that became controversial after the investigation was the resurfacing of old blog posts and online writings allegedly connected to Sherri that included racially charged comments and exaggerated personal stories, some of which were about people of Latino descent. Some reports also referenced prior claims that she had allegedly made involving abuse or harm that family members later disputed, so that's kind of unclear. This becomes important, though, because investigators pointed to a pattern of behavior rather than viewing the kidnapping story as a completely isolated event. Individually, none of these things completely disprove her story, but collectively, it complicates it. Cases like this rarely collapse all at once. Instead, they erode slowly. One inconsistency becomes two and then three. Investigators started realizing that they were spending more time trying to make the story fit than verifying the evidence that naturally supported it. Even some of the injuries raised complicated questions. Not because they weren't real, investigators agreed that she had clearly been injured, but because determining how and why those injuries occurred became far less straightforward than the public initially assumed. And through all of this, investigators remained relatively cautious publicly, which is part of why this case continued holding public sympathy for so long. There was no dramatic press conference declaring the story false, no immediate exposure, no shocking gotcha moment. Just a very slow, very methodical shift happening behind the scenes. And eventually, investigators decided they needed to answer one question more than any other. Where had Sherri Papini actually been for those 22 days? For years, investigators kept circling back to that unidentified male DNA. Because by that point, the case had reached an uncomfortable place. Publicly, the story still existed as a kidnapping investigation. But privately, investigators were increasingly trying to determine whether a kidnapping had happened at all. And eventually, advances in forensic genealogy helped break that stalemate. In March 2022, so about 6 years after the event, the DNA found on her clothing was traced to a man connected to Sherri Papini's past, an ex-boyfriend, James Reyes. And suddenly, the entire foundation of the case started shifting. Because investigators interviewed the ex-boyfriend, and initially he denied involvement. But eventually, according to federal investigators, his story changed dramatically. He admitted that Sherri had been staying with him voluntarily at his residence in Southern California during the period that she was supposedly missing. Not kidnapped, not trafficked, not held captive, voluntarily. According to court documents and investigative findings, Sherri had allegedly contacted him ahead of time and arranged for him to pick her up while she was on that run. He told investigators he drove from Southern California to meet her, then brought her back to his apartment where she stayed for weeks while the country searched for her. And honestly, this is the moment where the case almost becomes difficult to mentally reconcile with the version people had been invested in for years. Because investigators alleged that many of the injuries that had horrified the public were not inflicted by violent captors. Instead, according to the ex-boyfriend and federal findings, Sherri allegedly harmed herself in several instances. Investigators also alleged that she requested the branding mark herself and that he did it, which is such a jarring detail because the branding had become one of the most emotionally persuasive elements of the entire case. To the public, it symbolized brutality, proof that something horrific had happened. But investigators now believed it had been intentionally created as part of the deception. And suddenly, all of the earlier inconsistencies started aligning in a completely different direction. The missing evidence, the shifting descriptions, the absence of kidnappers, the unexplained DNA, and the timeline problems. It no longer looked like investigators were struggling to prove an abduction. According to later interviews and documentaries, one of the people most devastated by the investigation's conclusion was Keith Papini himself. Because publicly, Keith had become almost inseparable from the story. People remembered those emotional interviews, the desperation in his voice, the way he spoke about searching for his wife. And for years, Keith was defending Sherri and believed her version of events. But as investigators gathered more evidence, they eventually confronted him with what they believed had actually happened. In later interviews featured in Hulu's Perfect Wife, The Mysterious Disappearance of Sherri Papini, Keith described feeling manipulated, humiliated, and emotionally shattered by the unraveling of the case. That aspect of the story is easy to overlook once the word hoax enters the conversation. Because regardless of how people interpret Sherri's actions, there were real people around her emotionally living inside this narrative for years, including her husband, her children. Remember, she had 2 young children, friends, investigators, and an entire community that genuinely believed they were witnessing a violent abduction unfold in real time. So, on March 3rd, 2022, about 6 years after this happened, Sherri Papini was arrested by the FBI, accused of lying to federal agents and faking her own kidnapping to spend time with her ex-boyfriend, away from her husband and family. And in April 2022, 6 weeks after the arrest, she pled guilty in the U.S. District Court in Sacramento to 1 count of making false statements and 1 count of mail fraud as a part of a plea deal. She admitted to orchestrating the hoax. 33 other counts of mail fraud were dropped as part of this plea agreement. Her husband filed for divorce after her guilty plea. In the September 2022 sentencing hearing, she apologized and accepted full responsibility. In sentencing submissions, her attorney cited past mental health issues as contributors to her actions. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay restitution to cover the multi-state police investigation that the hoax prompted. Papini was released from prison in August 2023 and placed in a halfway house. And even after the reveal, the case continued provoking strong reactions because it forced people to confront something uncomfortable. Why had so many people believed the story just so completely? People wanted that story to be real because emotionally it makes sense to them. For a lot of people, the case of Sherri Papini seemed finished after her guilty plea in 2022. Federal investigators had publicly laid out their version of events. Sherri admitted to making false statements. She served prison time. And the public narrative largely settled into a single conclusion. The kidnapping had been a hoax. But then, years later, the story shifted again. In 2025, Investigation Discovery released a docuseries called Sherri Papini Caught in the Lie, which featured Sherri's first major on-camera interview since the federal case against her. And this documentary complicated the case all over again. Because in the series, Sherri does not fully maintain the version of events investigators presented. Instead, she claims that while she lied about major portions of the story, including inventing the 2 female kidnappers, she now says her ex-boyfriend, James Reyes, actually did abduct and abuse her during those 22 days. According to Sherri's newer account, Reyes became controlling and violent after picking her up. And she alleges that some of the injuries previously believed to be staged were not consensual, including the branding. That claim is significant because the branding had become one of the clearest symbolic examples of what investigators believed was manufactured evidence. But in the documentary, Sherri alleges that Reyes branded her against her will. The series explores previously undisclosed aspects of her personal life, including her marriage to Keith Papini, his character, and their subsequent custody dispute, her relationship with her ex-boyfriend James Reyes, and the post-nuptial agreement in place at the time of her disappearance. In the series and accompanying interviews, Papini claims that all her injuries, including bruises, the waist chain, the brand, were inflicted non-consensually by Reyes during her alleged abduction. However, he denied the allegation and passed a law enforcement-administered polygraph, stating that Papini had voluntarily stayed with him and that she both inflicted some injuries herself and asked him to assist in others, including the branding. Medical examiners and an FBI criminal analyst concluded that the wounds were consistent with deliberate, self-inflicted, or controlled injuries rather than signs of prolonged abuse or forced captivity. Papini also claims to have had bite marks on her body, which forensic experts later determined were actually rashes. Papini had a documented history of self-harm and falsely reported abuse. In 2003, so years before, 13 years before the abduction, her mother filed a report with the Shasta County Sheriff's Office alleging that Papini had been harming herself and blaming the injuries on others. The series also included reenactments, extensive interviews, and conversations surrounding Sherri's mental health and alleged long-standing patterns of compulsive lying and manipulation. And that's where the case becomes extremely difficult to untangle, because the documentary does not present Sherri as a perfectly reliable narrator. Even with her own newer version of events, she acknowledges lying repeatedly to investigators, the public, and people around her. So the audience is left trying to separate what was fabricated, what was exaggerated, and what, if anything, may still have been true. Meanwhile, James Reyes has strongly denied abducting or abusing Sherri. And importantly, investigators have not changed their position on the case. Federal authorities still maintain that the kidnapping was fabricated and that Sherri voluntarily stayed with Reyes during the period she was considered missing. Reports surrounding the investigation have also stated that Reyes passed that polygraph exam administered during the case. So even after the documentary, there is still no consensus about how much of Sherri's newest account, if any, accurately reflects what happened during those 22 days. And honestly, that may be why this case continues to fascinate people years later. Because most true crime stories eventually settle into one stable narrative. The facts solidify and the public lands somewhere. But the Sherri Papini case almost seems to resist resolution. Every version of story contains acknowledged lies. Every perspective leaves unanswered questions. And every major reveal seems to create an entirely new layer of uncertainty. It becomes a story about credibility itself, about how people perform victimhood, about how media narratives take shape, about whether someone can be deeply manipulative and still potentially experience harm, and about how difficult it becomes to locate the truth once trust has completely collapsed. Even now, nearly a decade later, people still argue about what actually happened during those 22 days. And maybe the strangest part is this. Depending on which version of the story you believe, Sherri Papini is either a survivor, a manipulator, or somehow both at the same time. What do we do with a narrator who may lie, manipulate, exaggerate, and still potentially be a victim? In the end, the case of Sherri Papini became something very different than the story the public thought they were watching in 2016. What began as a terrifying disappearance and apparent survival story ultimately unraveled into a years-long deception investigated by federal authorities. But I think part of why this case continues to fascinate people, because once people emotionally decide someone is a victim, questioning the story can start to feel cruel, even when the evidence begins pointing somewhere else entirely. And honestly, that may be the most unsettling part of this entire case. If you want to go deeper into this case, there are 2 major documentaries that approach the story very differently, and I mentioned them in this episode. Hulu's Perfect Wife, The Mysterious Disappearance of Sherri Papini, which largely explores the case through the perspective of Keith Papini, investigators, friends, and family members, as the kidnapping story slowly unraveled. And then that 2025 investigation discovery released that Sherri Papini, Caught in a Lie, which features Sherri's first interview and presents her newest claim of what happened during those 22 days. And watching both documentaries back to back almost feels like watching two completely different versions of the same story. So definitely go check those out. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of Cat Has Questions. Make sure to follow the podcast wherever you listen, leave a rating or review. You can also follow along on Instagram or TikTok for clips or updates. And as always, don't fake your own kidnapping. Stay curious. Thanks for listening to Cat Has Questions. If you liked this episode, follow the show and share it with someone who loves a good spiral. See you next week.